Hello, Magic players and collectors. Welcome to the Land Library. I'm your librarian, and in this episode of Legacy Logbook, I'll be covering multicolored lands. Strictly speaking, the last two episodes, dual colors and tricolors, would also be classified as multicolored lands, but those aren't usually commonly referred to by multicolors because they have names like dual colors and tricolors. So they already had videos, and this is for everything else, like everything above three colors. And it didn't take long for them to make the first multicolored land, because the first expansion set, Arabian Nights, introduced City of Brass. Most multicolored lands have some sort of trade-off balance for making any color of mana, and City of Brass does it by pinging yourself for 1 damage every time it gets tapped. To this day, this is still a pretty balanced effect, and sees occasional reprints and lots of play in formats that still allow it, such as Commander or Legacy. The second multicolor would come about a year later in Fallen Empires with Rainbow Veil. This one taps to add 1 mana of any color, but when you do so, control of Rainbow Veil passes to an opponent on your end step. And that means that when they use it, it will also pass again. It just keeps getting passed around. It's a very silly card. But we wouldn't see another multicolor until Alliances in 1996 with School of the Unseen. This land can tap for a colorless or pay 2 generic to tap and make a mana of any color. This is an awful trade-off, which sees next to no play in any format. To be fair, it wasn't as bad when it first came out, but it's since been pushed out by other filter lands that do it much better. And the next one pops up in Visions a year later with Undiscovered Paradise. This land can tap for any color, but on your next untap phase, it bounces back to your hand. This is a bit of a weird but fun effect, and it's easy to get around with decks that can get extra land drops for a turn. And the next one is actually 2 in the same set, Weatherlight. This set adds Gemstone Mine and Lotus Veil. Gemstone Mine enters with 3 counters and taps to remove 1 to make a mana of any color, but gets destroyed once it hits 0 counters. And Lotus Veil sacrifices 2 other specifically untapped lands, or it immediately destroys itself, and then it can tap to add 3 mana of any 1 color. Soon after, Tempest adds Reflecting Pool, the first land that doesn't just straight up make any color, but it does still have the potential to do so. It taps to produce a mana of any type another land you control could produce, which means that it has access to anything at different times or in different decks, just not on its own. If it's the only land you have, it can't make mana at all. Then the next one came in Urza's Saga with Thran Quarry. This land just simply taps to make a mana of any color, but at the beginning of your end step, if you have 0 creatures in play, it sacrifices itself. A couple of sets later, in Mercadian Mosques, we get Henge of Ramos, which is just a functional reprint of School of the Unseen, technically a different card, but they do the exact same thing. Now into the 2000s, the next one is Rhystic Cave out of Prophecy. This is one of the worst multicolors, or even just lands in general, because it can tap to make any color, but it can be countered by any player paying 1 generic. This is the only land that can have its mana ability responded to, which is a terrible trade-off. And the next one isn't very good either, but it's not quite as bad. It's Archaeological Dig out of Invasion. This land can tap for a colorless or can tap and sack to make 1 mana of any color. Now for something a bit different, Crystal Quarry from Odyssey is the first thing that doesn't make any color, it makes all colors. It's a filter land that for 5 generic taps to produce a white, a blue, a black, a red, and a green. No choices to be made, just 1 of each color. Although it can also just tap for a colorless if you need it to. But this isn't the only multicolor in Odyssey. This set also introduced Tarnished Citadel, which can tap for a colorless or tap for any color at the cost of 3 damage to yourself. This isn't a clone of City of Brass, but it's definitely in the same category, because it's a pain land too. And the next one is also a pain land, Grand Coliseum in Onslaught. This one comes in tapped, can tap for a colorless, or can tap for any color at the cost of 1 damage to yourself. Now finally we get to 8th edition, which does not introduce any new multicolored lands, but does change how they're presented. Up to this point, all non-basic lands, with the exception of dual colors, have had a gold frame, or some early sets just had their own frame colors, but 8th edition changed it so that only multicolored lands have gold frames, and lands that make either just colorless or no mana at all now get gray frames. So the first new actual gold frame is Glimmervoid in Mirrodin. A cousin to Thran Quarry, this land just taps for any color, but is sacrificed at your end step if you control 0 artifacts, as opposed to Thran Quarry's 0 creatures. Following this in Darksteel, Mirrodin's Core was introduced, which can tap to make a colorless, tap to add a charge counter, or tap to remove a charge counter to make a mana of any color. The third Mirrodin set, Fifth Dawn, has no lands in it at all, yet alone multicolors, so the next one comes in Champions of Kamigawa. It introduced Forbidden Orchard, which taps for any color, but also, whenever you do so, creates a 1/1 colorless spirit creature token on an opponent's battlefield. And you might think the next one would be in the following Kamigawa set, Betrayers of Kamigawa, which does have one, but it's actually not next, because in between these two standard sets was the set Unhinged, which has City of Ass. This hilarious land comes in tapped and taps for 1.5 of any color. And that's it. This is one of the freest tap for any color lands ever printed. However, it's not legal in most formats since it's from an unset. And speaking of unsets and their special format, City of Ass can tap for more than 5 colors. And this is a good time to pause and explain a little bit about some color-related things. Normally there are only 5 colors, however there are additional uncolors that only exist while playing silver bordered formats. These are specifically pink and gold, but this also means that any regular land that could make any color could also produce uncolors if played in a silver bordered format. Notably, this doesn't include colorless. Any land that can make any color of mana can't make colorless because it's not a color. But copying lands like Reflecting Pool can produce colorless mana because it's still a type of mana, even though it's not a color of mana. Now back to the regularly scheduled timeline with Tendo Ice Bridge from Betrayers of Kamigawa. This land enters with a single charge counter on it, and can either tap for a colorless, or tap and remove a charge counter for a mana of any color. It only gets the one, but at least it doesn't destroy itself when it runs out of counters like Gemstone Mine did. 4 sets later, we have Dissension adding Pillar of the Paruns, a land that taps for any color, but the mana can only be spent on casting multicolored spells. This is the first of many conditional mana abilities. This is going to be an archetype that is used quite a bit. Following another 4-set gap, we finally get to a new multicolor in Lorwyn, which is Shimmering Grotto. This is the first of a small group of related lands, the Grottos, which all can tap for a colorless or pay a generic and tap to make one of any color, aka filtering. And this also is the first any colored filter land that's a 1-for-1 instead of a 2-for-1. But that's not all. This set also drops the Vivid lands, which are a cycle of multicolors. Wait, a cycle? How can you have a cycle of things that make any color? Well, the Vivid lands all enter tapped with 2 charge counters, and can tap to remove a charge counter and make a mana of any color, but instead of tapping for colorless, like a lot of these other multicolors do, they can tap for their corresponding base color as their regular mana ability. This means that you could still remove a counter from them to make the color they already make, but that'd be kind of a waste of resources, so I'd recommend you don't do that. But it is an option. The following set, Morningtide, also has a multicolor, Primal Beyond. It comes in tapped unless you reveal an elemental card from your hand, and then can tap for a colorless or tap for any color, but that mana can only be spent on casting or activating abilities of elementals. A couple sets later, Conflux introduces three new multicolors: Ancient Ziggurat, Exotic Orchard, and Rupture Spire. Ancient Ziggurat is pretty straightforward. It just taps for any colored mana, but it can only be used to cast creatures, and with no other abilities, not even making colorless. Exotic Orchard is Reflecting Pool but copies from your opponent's lands instead of your own, and then Rupture Spire just taps for any color but comes in tapped and has a pseudo casting cost of 1 generic mana, or it immediately destroys itself. And then we hit a massive drought with no new multicolors for 2 years and two full blocks of sets until Commander 2011 drops one of the most famous lands of all time, Command Tower. This land taps for a mana of any color in your commander's color identity and is so much of a staple of the format, it's almost up to 100 different prints. It's only beaten out with more prints from the basics and Soul Ring. After a couple more sets with nothing, Avacyn Restored introduced another huge name, Cavern of Souls. This land has you choose a creature type, and it can tap to make a mana of any color, but can only be spent on casting a creature of that type. However, it makes that creature uncounterable. Otherwise, it can just tap for a colorless. The next set, Return to Ravnica, introduces Transguild Promenade, a land that enters tapped and has a pseudo-casting cost of 1, where it immediately destroys itself, and then it can just tap for any color when it's in play. The rest of the block had nothing new, but the first set in the next block, Theros, introduces our first legendary multicolor, Nykthos Shrine to Nyx. This land can tap for a colorless, or pay 2 generic and tap to choose any color, and create mana equal to your devotion to that color. And Theros also adds Unknown Shores, which is a generic filter land, just like Shimmering Grotto. So it taps for a colorless, or filters one generic into any color. Now, in a commander set again, we get Opal Palace, a land that taps for colorless or filters a generic into a mana of a color in your commander's color identity. And if you spend it on your commander itself, it enters with additional 1/1 counters equal to the number of times you've played it from your command zone this game. Then back in Standard, Journey into Nyx drops the next multicolor, Mana Confluence. This land is kinda just upgraded City of Brass. You pay 1 life instead of taking 1 damage, and you only pay life when actually using the ability, not just every time it's tapped. And then immediately stepping away from Standard again is the second legendary multicolor land, Paliano, the High City, coming in Conspiracy. Conspiracy is a set specifically meant for drafting, so Paliano was a bit of a weird one. When drafted, the players to your right and left, along with yourself, each choose a color, and Paliano can tap for any of those colors all game, but afterwards can no longer produce mana at all in constructed decks. This also is the first land that locks into specific colors instead of making the choice when activating the mana ability. Next up, in Magic 2015, is Sliver Hive. This land can tap for a colorless, or tap for any color, but that mana can only be spent on casting slivers. Additionally, while you already control a sliver, you can pay 5 generic and tap it to put a 1/1 colorless sliver creature token into play. The next one is also a specific creature type multicolor, Crucible of the Spirit Dragon from Fate Reforged. It can tap for colorless, pay 1 and tap to put a storage counter on it, or tap to remove X storage counters and make X mana in any combination of colors, but they can only be spent on casting or abilities of dragons. Followed by Haven of the Spirit Dragon in the next set, Dragons of Tarkir. This land can tap for colorless, tap for any color, but it can only be spent on casting dragons, or for 2 generic, it tap and sacks to return a dragon or Ugin Planeswalker to your hand from your graveyard. Yet another creature type land, Ally Encampment from Battle of Zendikar, is next. This land taps for colorless or any color, but it can only be spent on casting an ally or for a generic, it can tap and sack to return an ally from the battlefield to your hand. The following set, Oath of the Gatewatch, breaks the streak, but only kind of, because instead of a creature type, its colored mana can only be spent on cards with the keyword Devoid. Also, when it taps for a colored mana, it comes at the additional cost of a life. Although this set does have another one that definitely does break the streak. Holdout Settlement can tap for a colorless or tap an untapped creature to make a mana of any color. You may have also noticed, or perhaps already knew, but this is the first set to use the colorless mana symbol instead of a 1 for colorless mana. It would then be a few sets later before a new multicolor in Kaladesh in the form of Aether Hub. This set and, well, Plains gimmick is energy, an alternative resource to mana, and Aether Hub is a bit of a bridge between the two. It creates an energy when it enters and can tap to turn an energy into any color of mana, or it can just tap for a colorless. Then, in the other set in the two-set block, Aether Revolt introduced Spire of Industry, which is a pretty typical Pain land, except its ability to make any color can only be activated while you control an artifact. And then in the next set, Amonkhet, we get Crystal Quarry but better. Cascading Cataracts taps for a colorless and takes 5 mana for its filter ability, but instead of making one of each color, it makes 5 mana in any combination of colors, and even has Indestructible to boot. It's just a straight upgrade to Crystal Quarry. Amonkhet also has a generic filter land, Painted Bluffs, and the other set in the block, Hour of Devastation, has a clone of Holdout Settlement, Survivor's Encampment. Now for another Commander land, this time, out of Commander 2017, Path of Ancestry makes its debut. This classic land enters tapped and taps for any color in your commander's color identity, but additionally, if that mana is spent on casting a creature with the same creature type as your commander, which does include your commander, you scry 1. Then for the next set, Ixalan, there's 3 new multicolors. Unclaimed Territory, which has you choose a creature type when it enters, and can tap for a colorless, or for any color, but only for casting creatures of that chosen type. Then 2 lands that transform from artifacts, Lost Veil and Primal Wellspring, which both just tap for any color, but Primal Wellspring also has the added bonus of when the mana is spent on an instant or sorcery, it copies it, and you choose new targets for the copy. Now for another silly silver-bordered land, Secret Base out of Unstable. This land can tap for a colorless or tap for any color, but the mana can only be spent on casting a card with the same watermark. And there's 5 different prints of Secret Base, each with different watermarks, so you can use this more effectively in the different archetypes of the set. Back to Ixalan though, the other set of the block, Rivals of Ixalan, drops 2 more transformed lands, Sanctum of the Sun and Goldforge Garrison. Sanctum of the Sun simply taps for X mana of any one color, where X is your life total, and Goldforge Garrison taps for 2 mana of any one color, or, for 4 generic, can tap to create a 4/4 colorless golem artifact creature. Now moving on to the next block, Guilds of Ravnica introduces 2 more. Gateway Plaza, which enters tapped with a pseudo-casting cost of a generic, and then just can tap for any color, and Guildmage's Forum, which taps for a colorless and filters a generic into any color, but with the added bonus that if the mana is spent on casting a multicolor creature, it gets an extra 1/1 counter when it enters. Then another one in the following set, Ravnica Allegiance. This is Plaza of Harmony, which gives you 3 life if you control 2 or more gates when it enters, and then just taps for a colorless or taps for any mana a gate you control could produce. And questionably in the same block, but definitely on the same plane, War of the Spark adds Interplanar Beacon, a land that taps for colorless or filters a generic into 2 mana of any color, but it has to be 2 different colors and can only be spent on casting Planeswalkers. Then, whenever you do cast a Planeswalker, you also gain 1 life. On to Modern Horizons, we get Cave of Temptation, a land that taps for a colorless, filters a generic into any color, or at sorcery speed for 4 generic, it taps and sacks to put 2 1/1 counters on a target creature. Then we've got a revamped classic, Core Set 2020 introduces Lotus Field. It's basically the same as Lotus Veil, except it comes in tapped and it also has hexproof. And then we've got another silver-bordered land out of Unsanctioned, which is the Underdome. It taps for a colorless or taps for any color, but it can only be spent on silver-bordered cards. And then, hey, it's another cycle. That's rare. Jumpstart introduced the Thriving Lands, a cycle that enter tapped and choose a color other than their primary color, then they can tap for their primary color or the chosen color. This kind of makes them dual colors, but since you can choose any color, that's what makes them multicolors. Next up is Zendikar Rising, bringing 2 more to the game, Throne of Makindi, which can tap for a colorless, pay 1 and tap to put a charge counter on it, or tap to remove a charge counter and make 2 mana of any one color, but it can only be spent on casting kicked cards. And Base Camp, which comes in tapped, can tap for a colorless or tap for any color, but it can only be spent on casting abilities of clerics, rogues, warriors, or wizards. The next multicolor is Shimmerdrift Vale from Kaldheim, which is a snow land that enters tapped and you choose a color when it enters, it locks into that color, and then just taps for that color. A lot like the Thriving Lands, except it doesn't have a primary color, and it's a snow. Next up, another Commander land, Study Hall from Commander 2021. This land can tap for a colorless, or filter a generic into any color, and if you spend it on your commander, you get to scry X, where X is the number of times it's been cast from your command zone. Then we've got another double from Strixhaven School of Mages, with Archway Commons, which enters tapped with a pseudo casting cost of 1, and then just taps for any color. And Hall of Oracles, which taps for a colorless and can filter a generic into any color, or can tap to add a 1/1 to a target creature, but only if you've already played a sorcery or instant this turn. Then for a weird one, Power Depot from Modern Horizons 2. This artifact land enters tapped, taps for a colorless, or taps for any color, but it can only be spent on casting or abilities of artifacts. But the weird part is it has the keyword modular 1. Things with modular 1 enter with 1/1 counters equal to the modular number, in this case 1, and then can transfer that counter when it goes to the graveyard. But as a land with no transforming abilities or inherent ways to go to the graveyard, why does it have modular? Like, it can't use the 1/1, and it can't on its own go to the graveyard to move it somewhere else. Moving on, though, Adventures in the Forgotten Realms has the next one with Temple of the Dragon Queen. This land enters tapped unless you either control a dragon or reveal a dragon from your hand. Later in Tarkir Dragonstorm, this would be turned into a mechanic called Beholding. And then it locks into any color to then tap for that color. Skipping forward a couple of sets, the next multicolor is Voldaren Estate out of Crimson Vow. This land can tap for colorless, pay a life and tap for any color, but it can only be spent on casting a vampire, or for 5 generic, although this is reduced by 1 for each vampire you control, it taps to create a blood token. In the following set, Kamigawa Neon Destiny adds 3 more, Mech Hanger, which can tap for a colorless, tap for any color, but can only be spent on casting a pilot or vehicle, or for 3 generic, taps to crew any target vehicle. And then Secluded Courtyard, which has you choose a creature type when it enters, and taps for colorless or taps for any color, but only to be spent on casting or activating abilities of that chosen creature type, and Uncharted Haven, which enters tapped and just locks into a color. Pretty typical lock-in land. And then we get to Baldur's Gate, which drops 8 new multicolors, all of which are gates, and 5 of which are a cycle. Starting with said cycle, they all come in tapped and choose a color other than their primary color, and then tap for either of those colors. We've seen this before, but these ones are gates. And then there's Gone Gate, which taps for colorless or taps for any color another gate you control could produce, and has the wonderful ability that gates you control enter untapped. And then Heap Gate, which taps for a colorless, can filter a generic into any color, or for a generic, it taps and taps another gate you control to create a treasure token. And finally, Baldur's Gate itself, the thing everyone apparently is battling for. This is a legendary land that can tap for a colorless, or can filter 2 generic into X mana of any color, where X is the number of gates other than itself that you control. The next one is a bit of an unorthodox dual color. Cryptic Spires from Double Masters 2022 locks into 2 colors, but not when played. It locks in when you are building your deck. So while it's in a deck, it's strictly a dual color that enters tapped, but the fact that it can be any dual color is why it's still here in the multicolors. Then we're back to more regular multicolors in Dominaria United, with 3 new ones. Crystal Grotto, which is the second grotto, so is a filter land just like Shimmering Grotto, but also scries 1 when played. And then Plaza of Heroes, which has quite a few abilities. It can tap for a colorless, tap for any color, but that can only be spent on casting legendaries, tap for any color that any legendary you control is, or for 3 generic, it taps and exiles to give a target legendary creature hexproof and indestructible until the end of turn. And the third one in the set, Thran Portal, also has a lot of abilities going on. It is a gate that enters tapped unless you control 2 or less other lands. It chooses a basic land type when it enters and becomes that type in addition to its other types. And all mana abilities it has cost an extra life to activate. It doesn't have any printed mana abilities, but it does at least pick up the 1 from being a basic type, and potentially more from effects of other cards like Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth, which would still cost a life to activate. Also, since there's no printed mana abilities, something like Thespian Stage, which copies it already on the battlefield, does not get to choose a basic type and thus can't tap for mana at all. Then for a couple of silly ones from Unfinity, Nearby Planet, which enters tapped with a pseudo-casting cost of 1, and is all land types, including the basic types, so it can tap for all 5 of the main colors from being those basic types. And then Big Top, which taps for any color on the clothing top you're wearing, which also means that it can tap for uncolors if you're wearing them, or conversely, if you're not wearing a shirt at all, it can't tap for mana at all. Following those is Hall of Tagson out of Brothers War, which taps for colorless, filters a generic into any color, or for 4 generic, it taps to create a tapped Power Stone token. Then Phyrexia All Will Be One adds 2 more, the Mycosynth Gardens, which is a typical filter land, but also has the option to pay X mana to turn it into a copy of an artifact you control with mana cost of X. And then the Seed Core, which can tap for colorless or for any color, but it can only be spent on casting Phyrexian creatures, or while an opponent has at least 3 poison counters, you can tap it to give a target 1/1 creature +2/+1 until end of turn. And the next set is a double as well. The Lord of the Rings set introduces Great Hall of the Citadel, which can tap for a colorless or filters a generic into 2 of any combination of colors, but it can only be spent on casting legendaries. And Grey Havens, which is a legendary land that scries 1 when it enters and can tap for a colorless or tap for a mana of any color of legendary creatures in your graveyard. And the following set, Wilds of Eldraine, goes back to 1, Edgewall Inn, which enters tapped and locks into any color, and of course taps for that color, but also for 3 generic can tap to return a card in your graveyard with an adventure to your hand. Then for the Cousin of Greyhaven's, Gallifrey Council Chamber from the Doctor Who decks. It's just like Greyhaven's, including being a legendary, but it surveils instead of scries when it enters, and the limit on the colored mana is how it's spent instead of how it's made. So it can make any color, but it can only be spent on casting or activating abilities of a Time Lord or alien. Hopping back over to Standard, we get 4 more in the Lost Caverns of Ixalan. Captivating Cave, which can tap for a colorless, can filter a generic into any color, or at sorcery speed, and for 4 mana, tap and sack to give a target creature 2 1/1 counters. Then Pit of Offerings, which enters tapped and exiles up to 3 cards from any graveyard, then can tap for any color of those exiled cards, or just tap for a colorless. And Sunken Citadel, which locks into any color and can tap for a mana of that color, or tap for 2 mana of that color, but it can only be spent on abilities of lands. And the last one, the Core, which taps for X mana of any color, where X is the number of cards in your graveyard that are permanents. However, this is a land that can't just be played. It transforms from a legendary artifact, but transforming lands are pretty typical in Ixalan sets. Next up is surprisingly a gray-framed card from Murders at Karlov Manor, Branch of Vitu-Ghazi. This land is gray-framed because it can't actually tap for anything other than colorless. But if it is ever face down and is then turned face up, it produces 2 mana of any single color that don't go away between phases, which is slightly better than normal mana. And it even has a way to do it itself with Disguise 3, which lets it be played face down for 3 generic, and then later flipped up at any time for another 3 generic. Also, in the same set are 2 regular gold-framed multicolors, Public Thoroughfare, which comes in tapped, and has a pseudo casting cost of tapping either an artifact or land you control, and then just taps for any color. And Scene of the Crime, which is an artifact land with the clue subtype, which means it gets the inherent ability of a clue to pay 2 generic and sacrifice it to draw a card. It also comes in tapped, can tap for a colorless, or can tap and tap a creature you control to produce a mana of any color. And then onto the set with the most multicolors, excluding cycles. Outlaws of Thunder Junction, which has 5. One of them is technically from the bonus sheet, but a bonus sheet of a set is basically still that set, so it's included. And since I already brought it up, I'll start with that bonus sheet one. Tarnation Vista. It starts like a typical lock-in land, but it can also filter a generic into a mana of each color that you have a mono-colored permanent of, so potentially can make multiple mana, even all 5 of the main colors. Then Mirage Mesa, which is just a generic lock-in land, doesn't do anything else. Conduit Pylons, which is a pretty typical filter land, but also surveils one when it enters, and Cactus Preserve, which enters tapped, taps for any color another land you control could produce, or for 3 generic, it transforms into an XX creature, where X is the highest mana cost of your commander/commanders if you have more than one through like partner. And finally, Bucolic Ranch, which taps for any color, but it can only be spent on casting mounts, or for 3 generic, it taps to let you look at the top card of your library, and if it's a mount, you may reveal it and put it in your hand, otherwise it goes to the bottom of your library. It also can just tap for a colorless, which is pretty typical. And then there's another 4 that are added in Modern Horizons 3 Commander. Horizon of Progress, which taps and pays 1 life to produce a mana of any type that another land you control could produce. Which means it can make colorless, but probably make colored. It can pay 3 generic and tap to place a land onto your battlefield from your hand tapped, or its last ability is you can pay 1 generic, tap and sack to draw a card. Then Lazotep Quarry, which taps for a colorless, taps and sacks a creature to make a mana of any color, or at sorcery speed, you can pay X and 2 generic to tap and sack a desert to exile a creature with mana value of X from your graveyard and create a token copy of that exiled card, except it's a 4/4 zombie. And Planar Nexus, which is a basic filter land, except it has all non-basic land types. And finally, Talon Gates of Madara, which has an ability to be played from your hand for 4 mana, bypassing your land drop, phases out a target creature when it enters, then taps for a colorless, or can filter a generic into any color. And now back down to a bit more of a manageable 2 in the Assassin's Creed deck. Brotherhood Headquarters, which taps for a colorless or taps for any color, but it can only be spent on casting assassins or cards with free running or the activated abilities of just assassins. Then Abstergo Entertainment, which is a legendary that has classic Filterland abilities, but also for 3 generic, can tap and sack to return a historic card from your graveyard to your hand, and then you exile all graveyards. And another 2 in the next one, Bloomburrow. There's Hidden Grotto, the 3rd grotto, which is also a classic filter land, just like the other grottos, and Surveils 1 when enters. And this set has My Muse, 3-Tree City, a legendary that has you choose a creature type when it enters, and then taps for a colorless, or you can pay 2 generic and tap to make mana of any one color equal to the number of the chosen creatures you control. The following set, Duskmourn, has just one, Valgavoth's Lair, which for some reason is not subtype Lair, but is an enchantment. It also has hexproof, enters tapped, and is just a lock-in land. This is a very unique combination of traits, unfortunately that doesn't make it a very good card. Then, actually skipping past a set, which hasn't happened in a while, we get to Night Market from Aetherdrift, which is another lock-in land that enters tapped, but also has cycling 3. And for another nice easy set to cover with only one, Tarkir Dragonstorm adds Maelstrom of the Spirit Dragon, which can tap for a colorless or for any color, but it can only be spent on casting a dragon or omen, or for 4 mana, it can tap and sack to search your library for any dragon, reveal it, and put it in your hand. But the nice 1 in a set streak ends there, because we're back up to 3 in Final Fantasy. There's Capital City, a classic filter land, but with cycling 2, Crossroads Village, which is a classic lock-in land with nothing else, and Starting Town, which comes in tapped unless it's within your first 3 turns, not the first 3, just yours. Then taps for a colorless, or taps for any color, but at the cost of a life. And now we're down to the last couple of sets, so there's not much left. Just Command Bridge from Edge of Eternities, which enters tapped as a pseudo-casting cost of tapping any permanent, and then simply taps for any color. And the final set, Marvel Spider-Man, which adds 2, Daily Bugle Building, which is a typical filter land, but also, for a generic, it taps to give a target legendary creature menace until end of turn. And Multiversal Passage, which is a lock-in land but locks into a basic land type instead of a color, and enters tapped unless you pay 2 life. Basically, Thran Portal if Thran Portal was good. And that's it. That is the current full timeline of multicolor lands, because there will almost certainly be more in the future. Not even almost. There will certainly be more in the future. There's been lots of different ways they've done multicolors, and plenty of repeats too, and I'm sure there will be plenty more ways they do it later. But this video is already long enough, so I'll leave it there and just move on to the trivia. There are many fetch lands that can grab any colored basic, but unlike the dual color fetches, which have the colored frames, these have gray frames, and thus I did not include them as multicolors in the timeline, but I still think they deserve an honorable mention in the trivia. These include Thawing Glaciers, Terminal Moraine, Terramorphic Expanse, Evolving Wilds, Ash Barrens, Myriad Landscape, Warped Landscape, Prismatic Vista, although for some reason that one has a gold frame, Fabled Passage, which also has a gold frame, Shire Terrace, Promising Vein, Escape Tunnel, Urza's Cave, and Vibrant Cityscape. There are also some copying lands like Vesuva, Echoing Deeps, and Thespian Stage, which could possibly make any color of mana, but are themselves not multicolors. Then we have in the set Shadowmoor, they printed Reflecting Pool with an error on the foils specifically, where the white mana symbol background is under the text box like what would normally be on a basic Plains, even though this is not a basic Plains. There is a silver-bordered creature called Avatar of Me, which is the color of its owner's eyes, but since you can be as specific or generic as you'd like with your color description, or even wear colored contacts to change your eye color, it means there's an infinite number of potential uncolors, which lands could theoretically produce even if Avatar of Me isn't in play. Funnily, this means you can make silly mana colors to match lands, like City of Ass can tap to produce brown mana, or City of Brass could tap to produce brass mana. Path of Ancestry actually released on Magic Online in the treasure chest cards before being printed in the physical game. And as far as I can tell, this is the only land that has had this happen, where it got a digital version first and then got a physical print later. Or at least it's the only one I could find that I covered in this video. And that about wraps up everything on multicolored lands. If you've made it this far in the video, please drop a like for Turn and subscribe for more Landfield content. If I missed anything, got anything wrong, or you just have questions, let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next Legacy Logbook about subtypes.